But first, a word from our sponsors. Finding time for these videos is hard, but if you'd like to support them, then consider grabbing a free audiobook at audible.com/bunnyhop. Sponsorship is something I'd usually want to tiptoe around, but for this topic in particular and for Audible, it makes a whole lot of sense to me because, did you know The Witcher was a series of books before it was video games? And Audible.com has most of the books that have made it into English, including the very first anthology you should start with, The Last Wish, read by the Cockney antics of Peter Kenny. Playing through these games and reading the books at the same time has been a pretty great experience. It really lowers the bar for immersion. You end up getting a lot of jokes and references you wouldn't have otherwise, so give it a try. Audible.com/bunnyhop. And with that being said, let's get this show started. The whole Witcher video game series is a spoiler. Every game in which Geralt goes on any wacky adventures further contradicts his very canonical and very real death written at the end of the last book. That's why the most recent Witcher book, published in 2013, is actually a prequel to the previous 1999 book. The author isn't going to bring Geralt back to life. He thinks that's dumb. He thinks the whole game timeline is dumb. And I noticed when some viewers heard me talk about Geralt's death in the video game, they considered that a spoiler. But it's literally the first minutes of the first game. It's not something I'm super bitter about. So imagine the irony I felt when getting past the prologue of Witcher 3 and finding out that Ciri is apparently the daughter of Emperor Emhyr, who was Dunny the Urchin all along and didn't actually die at a storm at sea, and Ciri can apparently portal through time and space and is the most powerful being in the world or something. I was just getting to that part. Why did I even bother trying? The Blood of Elves is the first Witcher book in the Witcher saga, which differentiates it from the first two anthologies that might actually be a more satisfying read just by themselves. Because this time, the book's just one part of a long series rather than a lot of little parts, so it moves much slower and it's much less eventful, and that's also partially because of a shift of protagonists. Geralt is more of a side character this time, a major side character, but the vast majority of the word count here is dedicated to Ciri instead, his adopted and supposedly orphaned daughter who spends a good half of the book training to be a Witcher at Kaer Morhen. Which means that the first few minutes of The Witcher 3 are gloriously indulgent, delightfully peppered and plumped fan service. Imagine the surprise of reading this exact same scenario in the pages of a book minutes before seeing it suddenly come to fully interactive, cutting-edge life. But just a few of the details are wrong. Yennefer wasn't there, and the book Triss was. Turns out it was all a dream, and Geralt even notices the discrepancy. It's like he's reading my freaking mind here. It's a pretty weird situation when the writers, the characters, and the players are all facing the same problem. And that problem is how to be introduced to two incredibly important characters of a long-running series that hasn't seen them at all at this point. Yennefer is Geralt's primary love interest throughout the saga. She shows up at Book 1. In the book, Ciri soon becomes more of the protagonist than Geralt himself, and she shows up in Book 2. But then along comes a game series, where Geralt loses his memory because that's easier for games writing, and Triss happens to be the first woman he wakes up next to, and Ciri is nowhere to be found. So with their reappearance in the third game, someone's got a lot of explaining to do. The kind that would start fights and cause people to pick a side. Because after reading these books, Triss ends up coming out of this anachronism looking like one of the most creepy and manipulative characters ever, robbing Geralt of his history with Yennefer just so she can have his hot, sterile, and immune Witcher bod all for herself.
Someone's been taking advantage of me.
I have, for one.
I've never even intimated.
We need to hurry.
After all, how was he supposed to know? He lost his memory. But now he's supposed to have it back.
Remember Tredegor? Hunting that Zoogle in the trash heap? You spent half the next day bathing, scrubbing yourself.
How can I forget?
Which isn't completely a good thing. Forgetting about the most important people in his life for months at a time makes for some pretty awkward confrontations.
I'd heard you and Triss made a great couple.
Yen, I'd lost my memory.
Really? That's your excuse?
Which side, and which sorceress you choose, if any at all, may depend on how much you've read. In other words, how much of Geralt's video game memory you have virtualized as opposed to his book memories, with branching paths available for both options. That's just one of a billion clever writing tricks in this thing that really elevates this game to the next level. I was a little worried here. The Witcher series has always been dangerously close to substituting clever writing and interesting characters with some kind of thoughtlessly edgy, M-rated badassery, the kind that its own marketing portrays the games as.
What are you doing?
Killing monsters.
But no, it turns out we're cool. The game gets it. It even makes a joke about it.
Vesemir told me about that job you did for those Nilfgaardians in Velen. What? What are you doing? Killing monsters. Good one.
Just came out that way.
It's really important that this game chooses to make fun of itself, and to make the best of all of its depraved situations. A silver lining of optimism is really the line between writing that comes off as contrived versus mature. You're not really pulling any punches when a story with as much misery as this one manages to look on the bright side of it all. After a few hours of monotone fantasy babble, the narrative can gladly switch out the sad mask for a laughing one. There's no way an audience that's both gasping and laughing is going to be bored. Just think about Gwent and how much of an inconsistency that is. It's one of the most enjoyable minigames ever, and it's also a complete anomaly of the lore and the setting. Apparently, these miserable mud-farming peasants have enough time and money on their hands to indulge in a collectible card game. Apparently, this casino deals exclusively in a game of strategy and grinding. These cards cast only characters relevant to the player's adventures in a game that goes far out of its way to hide the player's omnipotence. Gwent is a magnificent game, and it is also a joke. Ciri is a 15-strength hero card, and no one knows who or what Ciri is. The whole thing is one of the best minigames ever and one of the most casually underplayed fourth wall breaks ever. It's freaking great. The third game returns us to the first game setting of Temeria, home of the world's flimsiest trees. And that choice of setting is just one of many spiritual throwbacks to The Witcher 1, including the more lighthearted tone that cracks jokes, takes breaks, and doesn't take itself too seriously, while also dealing out serious content, all while increasing the scale and spectacle of pretty much everything to make for a satisfying jump in production for a sequel. In the first game, you had to compose a poem with a bard to exorcise a couple of angry ghosts. In the third game, you have to compose a play with the bard to encode a secret message for a doppelganger hidden somewhere in the crowd. What I feel like a lot of people might not notice, and what the second game kind of forgot about, and what separates The Witcher from a lot of D&D Forgotten Realms kitsch, is that The Witcher is really closer to Shrek than it is Game of Thrones. It's a series of jabs at the kind of European fables, legends, and folklore that are more readily found in Disney movies than Tolkien. The bread and butter for its quests are grim spin-offs of Grimm's already grim fairy tales, which is why this game's many little stories make cynical twists on Snow White and the Seven Dwarves, Cinderella, Hansel and Gretel, Bluebeard. Fun fact, one quest, A Tower of Mice, is based off of an old German tale about a ruthlessly evil ruler who flees a peasant revolt before being locked in a tower where he's eaten alive by mice. The music, especially, is thoroughly engineered to evoke that romanticized fantasy version of pagan Europe, with a return to catchy melodic Celtic jigs and a more bold step into shrill female vocals, brought to you courtesy of a collaboration with the folk band Percival, which is actually named after a character from the Witcher books. This thrilling, intense battle music is called Steel for Humans. But it's actually a remixed version of a Percival song they call Lazare. And that is a traditional Bulgarian wedding song about wishing a young couple good health. So its usage in the game sure was a stretch. These light flavors of Eastern European culture may feel exotic, but the mainstream Western European fairy tales backing the majority of the content are very familiar. The interpretations of these tales are gritty and explicit, but they are also empathetic. Hansel and Gretel's trail of treats leads to an orphanage. Kira Metz's romance subplot uses Cinderella to theme a date night. The Bloody Baron, who's analogous with the wealthy and homicidal Bluebeard, manages to be an incredibly likable and deplorable character at the same time, because he knows what he's done and feels genuine regret over it. Even though nearly everyone in this universe has their dark secrets, no one in The Witcher will easily believe themselves to be the bad guy. Notice how many times after you chop up a bandit camp, you'll find letters they left behind mentioning their families or their future plans. It feels a bit forced sometimes, but it's an approach to world building and character development that is oddly sympathetic, and, dare I say it, kind of realistic. Rationalization, denial, and victim blaming are the motivations for the closest thing this series has to villains. Valiant heroism usually causes more trouble than it solves, and sometimes the best policy is to just not get involved. The fleeting glances we get of the crones of Crookback Bog, whose visual and audio designs hint at an outright inhuman level of cruelty, are still fraught with moral ambiguity. which includes a never-ending stream of hidden little butterfly effect choices that don't look super relevant at the time, but slowly snowball into unexpectedly massive, but logical, story changes. Maybe you'll do the wrong thing and have to rationalize it for yourself. No matter what happens, you'll have to live with it, because this Witcher actually deletes your old autosaves. There's no going back. But all of that talk about hidden decisions and moral ambiguity is nothing new for the series. It's been doing all of that fantastically since day one, but it's always been a series of janky, unpolished, or technically unreliable games that had to be loved for their better half in spite of their worse half. So what is new in this third game is a huge step up in polish, its scope scaled up along with its playability, as well as its change to a slightly lighter tone, now with lively, catchy music tracks and graphics that paint a brighter, cleaner, and more colorful picture. And thanks to the occasionally cheery atmosphere, I ended up getting a lot of the same thrills I did from the early 3D Zelda games, which may be a bit of a stretch, but hear me out here. They're both 3D third-person action adventures that harken back to classic, wholesome themes of fairy tales and heroes' journeys. You have an expanding inventory of gadgets that solve environmental puzzles, you talk to sentient rock monsters, you race horses, you sail a wide-open sea full of underwater treasure and little mini-adventure islands. And you also lock onto bad guys and mash the attack button. Thankfully, it gets more complicated than that. On the second to hardest difficulty I was playing, combat was a real treat, and probably the single most thrilling factor I enjoyed about this game. Combat has always been the weak point of the series, but after 3 games of experimenting with different styles, they've developed it to a point where it's one of my favorite combat systems for a sprawling Western RPG ever. The first game had a weird, rhythmic, point-and-click hybrid Baldur's Gate thing going on, and the second game felt like a poor man's Demon's Souls, broken by shoddy collision detection and unbalanced backstabbing rules. The third game mostly iterates on the second game, but fixes almost all of the problems with it by simply giving you the ability to walk to your side. This time, the lock-on button actually locks your camera on to a target, and you can strafe around it. In fact, they really want you to strafe. Strafing is mandatory even if you're not locked on. You barely can't strafe. You have to take a stamina penalty hit for breaking it. That backstab bonus from the second games is still there, but you're always facing your opponents by default. It seems like they really didn't want players to leave themselves open for those backstabs. And since Geralt's primary defense is still evasion, they went all out this time with 2 different dodge buttons for quickly maneuvering into 2 different distances with 2 different speeds with 2 different recovery times, effectively doubling the player's strategic evasive options. And it seems that to mitigate the increased amount of options the player has, they decrease the speed of it all. Geralt's strafe is a godsend, but his movement speed when doing it is a snail's crawl. You move faster by dodging where you want to go rather than walking there, which makes getting your own backstabs in take work, and further explores the Witcher's danceable combat styles described in the books. And it also reaches into a diverse bag of tricks, inspired by some of the most beloved combat systems around, from Dark Souls to the Batman Arkham series to Japanese character action games, which is a point I sure wanted to stick with as soon as I saw series DMC Dash. The punishingly slow traps from the second game were replaced with a little crossbow that ends up functioning, surprisingly, like the guns in Bloodborne. It's more for interrupting enemies, pestering them, and luring them into feints rather than actually damaging them. The common monster's AI, and their hefty amount of dodge animations, have them dodging as their most basic predictable move, which brings back memories of Ninja Gaiden, where the common enemies would rather flip and dance all around you rather than blindly go in for an attack. Your most useful button is not your attack button, but rather combos of the dodge, then attack buttons. Sidestepping out of the way of a blow and then following up with your own is really the only reliable way to guarantee a safe hit at all. Combine that with the active parry mechanic, which rewards you for feeling out Arkham counters that aren't telegraphed, and you have a system that increases tension by rewarding you for constantly lowering your guard in the midst of danger. It's intense, and it also feels like Geralt's default moveset now gives you options, real options, for overcoming fights with skill and applied learning rather than stat sheets or exploits, as demonstrated by a quick new game that had me dancing around untouched in fights that gave me a really hard time the first run. It's not perfect, it's not even truly excellent, but the fact that it's so many leagues ahead of any combat Bethesda has managed to pull out, while simultaneously managing a game with as much scope and complexity as theirs, is something that I think is kind of amazing. Combat in an RPG is generally pretty awkward unless you're Dark Souls, but Finally, something else has come close. It takes a lot of selective elements from other games and applies them to its own goal, which is to translate the way a Witcher is described to fight in the books into a game. That's why your simple fast attack button doesn't just make Geralt slash his sword, but rather pivot into a 360-degree spin that carries his momentum into slashing his sword. It's lore-appropriate combat for a game about lore-appropriate role-playing, which was what was so unique about the first game. It was a thoroughly robust RPG system about playing just one role, a CRPG job class pulled from the books and given a game that punishes the player for not going through the same rituals this character would. Meditation, potion brewing, blade oiling, researching, and investigating makes for a verb list of gameplay actions that encompass almost everything this character would do, streamlined in the third game into the most complex system, while also managing it on a budget of button presses. The amount of potions increased exponentially. There's a whole new genre of them, and 3 tiers of upgrades for each one, and they once again require alcohol as a base. But they also automatically refill after every rest, which you'll need to do since they're capped out at 2 to 4 bottles per rest. They only last for a few seconds, but can be immediately consumed in the middle of a battle, solving the problem from the second game where potion buffs would expire before you can really use them. The list of blade oils is, once again, much bigger and more complicated, but they can be applied an unlimited number of times, but since there are more of them, they apply to a smaller and more specific subgroup of monsters, which means you have to pay attention to them and change them out more often. The bestiary is more easily readable than ever, and is filled either by directly fighting monsters or following a contract quest for them, decreasing the steps it takes to prepare for battles while increasing the amount of preparatory knowledge you get out of them. The investigation and detective work that was formerly written into the dialogue system is now an entire mechanic of its own. The Witcher senses have the players following obvious breadcrumbs that require just a bit of mental working to dig up, but they're mostly there to solve the classic open-world RPG problem of taking all the thought out of blindly following objective map markers. It's not totally perfect, though. Gwent and horse racing stick out like a sore thumb. They don't fit the character from the books, or the games really either. At least Gwent's fun as hell. The horse races are not so lucky. My biggest issue with the game has to do with the way it rewards players for questing and looting, because anything that's not one of the main quests just doesn't do that. It pretends like it does, but if you're aiming to spend some time soaking in the scenery and the people outside of the main quests or the Witcher gear treasure hunts, the sheer length and detail put into side quests is a real spectacle. Even the most throwaway of monster hunts have entire minutes of cutscenes put into them. Some of the most major characters from previous games show up in what are throwaway optional content in this one. But a few hundred gold and 20 or so XP rewards for the rewards won't get you far. If you want to level up and develop your skills efficiently, you're better off ignoring all of that great content. It creates a problem where you can play for hours clearing out a huge list of side quests, but not really feel like you're getting anything done once you finish them all. Which reminds me, my other big gripe here is something made worse by the constant patching and content additions they've been giving to this game since launch. They added a couple of higher-level in-game quests to earlier areas, and since you can't preview a quest recommended level until after you've accepted it, you'll find a whole lot of worried villagers who will gladly sit around and wait for months for you to level up and do that thing they wanted you to do forever ago. You have no way of knowing whether or not a quest is for now or later until after it's already on your to-do list. Likewise, if you want good gear, you're better off ignoring the vast majority of it and sticking to just the Witcher gear treasure hunts. The game establishes very early on that the Witcher gear will be the best available items per their increments of level requirements, meaning that if you decide to take the time and care into min-maxing your stats by wearing other armors you'll soon outlevel, you're just wasting your time, especially since these crafting menus needed to make them are awfully time-consuming. Why can't I hide these old diagrams so I don't have to scroll past them every time I want to look at my armor menu? There's definitely something wrong going on when upgrading 2 sets of armor had me flipping in and out of these menus for a full 30 minutes. And that's even after they added a feature that saves time by pinning crafting formulas to other menus. And speaking of laggy, time-consuming UI elements with big chunky text for console-style viewing, this minimap looks awfully familiar. Those icons are straight out of Far Cry. The whole way exploration is handled feels awfully Ubisoft-ish. with you sprinting from question mark to methodically clear away a list of sandbox checkboxes. The sheer density and the constant need for map markers to be everywhere, it feels like a bit of a stretch. Like just enough of an abstraction to spoil the illusion of this world. They had me staring at the minimap more than the rest of the screen, and as the game went on, at some point, I decided to just turn it off. And I ended up enjoying myself way more once I did. There are enough directional hints elsewhere on the screen to do this. Dialogue has just enough directions to help you find things without a map. Important NPCs will still have clear labels floating above their heads. Witcher senses lead you around to where you need to go, and the on-screen objective reminder is just enough to keep you focused. You will get lost, and once you do, the big map is just one quick button press away. I totally recommend giving this a shot. If you're on consoles, here's a tip. Hold start for a little while to instantly jump in and out of that big map. The thrill of charting routes by geographic landmarks, scanning the horizon for those landmarks, and eventually feeling out a way to your intended destination is a great sensation. It's much more rewarding and immersive to be using your head rather than your HUD, and with a more minimal HUD configuration, this game turned from a great sandbox game into what may be one of my most favorite RPG experiences ever. And with that assessment, we have a series of 3 games that has 2 of some of the best RPGs ever. The Witcher is a trilogy that took its sweet time between installments, where each one feels fundamentally different from the last and represents a scale of quality that was constantly sliding upwards. Maybe the most telling factor is the faces. We've gone from these horrifying Blender doll potato people to some truly cutting-edge tech. And with that improvement also came the performances. The voice acting and the writing improve in each game even more than the tech does.
Ow! Ow! Ow!
Youthfully, my dream come the morning, your scent berries tart.
The days of laughable voice acting and alien character models are over, and so too are easy villains. Even the skeletal Black Knights of the Wild Hunt turn out to have their own justifiable ambitions. It's a far cry from the cartoony levels of dastardliness seen by the Professor and Azar Javed in the first Witcher game. The cast, the motives, and the goals of Witcher 2's plot were murky, and so was the morality of its characters. This is something that got rightly praised, but after playing all 3 games in a row, it ended up looking like the one with the least footing among the trilogy. The one with the shakiest ideas and the most confused mechanics. It's juggling the heavy choices and consequences of an old-school CRPG with a whole lot of barely usable vanity features, like QTE bosses and dialogue skills that the player has no way of developing. The third game manages to rectify a lot of those downgrades while also taking the risk of going open world. And that's a move that typically opens up so many holes that developers can't fill them fast enough. Even though The Witcher 3 is a hell of a lot more polished this time, they still missed a couple spots. But they hit a damn good amount of others, giving the whole world and its characters a more overwhelming amount of attention that a game of this kind has yet to have seen. What's a real treat about playing all 3 games back to back is how the designs for some returning areas stayed exactly the same from the first game to the third. Playing the entire trilogy feels like a consistent, cohesive experience despite how different each game is. But I am so grateful that all of this ended on such a high note.